Good morning and welcome. My name is Judy Hazen and I'm a member of the Chats for Champions committee here at Skidompha Library. And these chats are sponsored by the First Bank in Damariscotta with its 16 branches, and it's located on Main Street, as I'm sure many of you already know. To give you some advance notice, the next chat is on April 9th here in the Porter Meeting Hall. It will be a panel of Maine crime writers, Kate Flora, Dorothy Cannell, and Barbara Ross. I'm sure some of those are familiar to many of you. Before we begin this morning's chat, I want to thank Mal Gormley, our videographer. His work makes these recorded chats available for loan to library patrons, should they happen to miss a particular chat. And now, we ask that you silence all electronic devices, please. We're happy to have as our speaker this morning part-time Bristol resident, Professor John Tchen, who is co-founder of New York City's Museum of Chinese in America and is its senior historian. The museum is dedicated to the preserving and presenting of the history, culture, and diverse experience of people of Chinese descent in the United States. Dr. Tchen received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin, his master's degree from NYU, and a PhD in history also from NYU. He is the founding director of the Asian Pacific American Studies Institute at NYU and associate professor of history also at NYU. John wears many hats: teacher, facilitator, public historian, curator, builder of research collections of Asians in the Americas, and here I'm going to quote, dumpster diver of fragments of the past. Maybe he'll explain that to us. He has authored several award-winning books: New York Before Chinatown, Orientalism and the Shaping of American Culture, and Genthel's Photographs of San Francisco's Old Chinatown. He is co-author of the book Yellow Peril, which you'll see over on the table, among some other books of his. In 1991, Professor Tchen was awarded the Charles F. Frankel Prize from the National Endowment for the Humanities, renamed the National Medal of Humanities. Please help me welcome this morning Dr. Tchen.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful actually speaking here, and I'm here a lot, so some of you may see me. I'm actually constantly here when I'm in town, and it's really one of my favorite parts in the world, being here. And Judy and I, who's here, we've been together for a long time, and we have a daughter together, and she's also my wife. But also friends and neighbors who really appreciate coming. Jill, and it's great seeing other people as well, so thank you. We almost didn't make it here this morning because the whole series of events started happening. I'm not sure if, you'll see that the talk is about a little bit about ghostliness and being haunted. And I feel like something was going on because this morning, the power went out, which happens a lot. But before that, the water heater went out. And a couple months ago when I came, I found a spout of frozen water from the tip of my shower all the way down to the drain. So I've been kind of unraveling all these things. So this morning I was thinking, I had to consciously think about driving more slowly because I knew I was going to get a ticket. And then we're going to get a flat tire and then maybe walk here or crawl here. So I'm glad to be here. Happy spring, everybody. Actually, in New York, it is starting to feel like spring, so I think it's going to come here as well. Okay, but you never know. I should just, I guess I wanted to say that there's a whole range of things I'd be happy to talk about. I did prepare maybe some slides to give you a feeling for some of the issues that I deal with. But as you can see, these issues are things that I deal with in a variety of ways. I do think of myself in some ways primarily as someone who engages with the public through exhibits and slideshows and films and other ways and speaking around issues that we all are enmeshed in. But also, of course, I'm a historian, and that these days, oftentimes a historian means that you teach at a university. But I don't see my work as being strictly related to academic work. I really see it as a public work. So let me kind of talk a little bit about one of my obsessions, okay, which is about collecting things. So one of my great loves that brought me, that has kept me coming back to Maine, is of course all this great stuff that's up here, flea markets and barns and everything else. And part of my obsession is collecting certain things. Now, I think part of it is because my mother, who was a refugee from China, lived in China during the 30s, during a huge time of inflation, and she would describe having barrel loads of money to go buy a dozen eggs, right? That kind of life. So I was born in this country, but she kind of imbued this sense that you can't throw away a single paper bag or a single plastic bag, so you can just imagine the sink underneath, the kitchen sink was just loaded with stuff. And Judy will attest to the fact that I carry on that proud tradition to this day. But part of it is also like finding, well, you have to make a living and have a profession, so it's like, how do you translate that into something useful, right? Besides, of course, plastic bags are reusable. So collecting things has become kind of my substitute for that childhood upbringing, but also collecting books and really dealing with issues that began to catch my imagination, but also began to trouble me. So let me kind of show some of this stuff, and then I'm really happy to talk about the Museum of Chinese in America, films I'm working on. I'm working on a film with Rick Burns on Chinese exclusion that's going to come out on the American Experience in another year or so, among other projects. So I'm really happy to talk about all of those things. So let's start. I should just say that we're starting with the idea that we're all very complex people, okay? And that sometimes that complexity is forced on you from the outside in the way people see us, whether you're a woman or a certain kind of, come from a certain part of the country. Sometimes the complexity comes from within us. Of course, we're all very complex from within. And sometimes it's a combination of both, right? And I think, in fact, probably for all of us, it's a combination of both. So that's part of what I want to talk about, is that kind of complexity that formulates how the American self and how at various moments in time in various places, otherness, that self also creates an otherness. And an otherness, I think we all depend on others. We all depend on others to better understand ourselves. But sometimes that otherness comes out of a rejection of a certain part of oneself and a projection onto some other. And you'll get a sense of what I mean by that when I begin to show some of these images. So the topic of this talk is our haunted futures. And one of the wonderful things I get to do as a curator and as a historian, I get to put artifacts together. I think of an artifact as really any anecdote, a story, obviously an object that I pick up at a flea market. It could be any range of things, but an artifact emerges at a certain time and a certain place. So a joke I hear in Maine in 1970, that's an example of an artifact. And artifacts come in many different forms. So I wanted to kind of talk about a number of artifacts and then how we can begin to kind of put them together. And this is what I do, is I put artifacts together. And when you put artifacts together from a different time and place together, all of a sudden you get potential meaning that's generated out of that juxtaposition. And that's really what curators do when you do exhibits, for example. The first artifact is something that happens to me all the time, has happened to me much more. As I said, I was born in this country, but despite that fact, I get this compliments all the time, and I said, well, thank you, is my response. I'm not always sure how to respond. And then, of course, the next question is, where do you come from? And I say, Wisconsin. But that's never a good enough answer. It's never a good enough answer. I always have to then say, well, and I know exactly what they're asking. I mean, after about 20 times of being asked this throughout my life, well, like by the age of 12, you kind of figure out that this is a pattern. And what's interesting is that as I began kind of sharing this story with so many other Asian Americans and Asians in this country, this is a very common story. So I would encourage you, if you have an Asian friend, and maybe you've heard this story before, and of course it's not just about Asians, but there's something about the way I look and how that's automatically assumed to be that I'm not from here, or I'm not from there. I'm a foreigner, automatically, right? So that's the first artifact. The second artifact is a fascination with difference. And of course we all have that. The self and the other is always a play of difference. And sometimes it's a play of difference in a very innocent way. Sometimes it's more freighted with historical issues. So I think usually at the university I'm kind of the oldest one in the room, right, by far. And oftentimes could be my students' parent, or sometimes even their grandparent. But I think in this room I feel comfortable in saying, how many of you remember when Nixon went to China?
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody, okay, good. I feel I'm in good company here. I'm feeling like an old codger. And I don't know if you remember, but when Nixon went to China, one of the big things that was advertised was, well, that was on the news, was the banquet that he went to, right? Okay, so this image is another artifact of that time, right? 1972. This is Joe and I. This is kind of an odd image of Nixon. First of all, what's amazing is that he's using chopsticks very well. And I don't know how long he practiced on that, but he's doing a very good job. He's very, but he's kind of looking at this object. I didn't mean to make that the point of this artifact. But I just pulled this online when I was at Becky's this morning, so it just happens to be what I found. But restaurants, the banquet was a source of fascination for Americans all across the country. I don't know if you remember that. But it became so much a point of the news that Chinese restaurants all around the country began serving that 10-course or 20-course banquet that Nixon had. Okay. So that's an example of this kind of fascination with exotica, right? In some ways, China had been out of the news and very much thought of as the equivalent at that time of the evil empire, right? I mean, when Reagan talked about the evil empire, and the axis of evil, when George Bush was talking about the axis of evil, at that time, China was still very much considered not a place that Americans should go to or deal with. And it put, as you can imagine, people such as myself were automatically seen as foreign in a kind of weird, difficult position. Okay. The next artifact I want to show you is really about a kind of comic otherness. And again, this is part of a larger pattern that is a fragment that I've been trying to grapple with in the exhibitions I deal with, and the teaching I do, and the writing I do. And let me just show you a quick example of this, which I love, that you can get off of YouTube. And I'm going to show this now. Is that coming up okay? Can you see that all right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is from 1930. is very important. There always has to be a pause. Chinaman mice, ruining the collars, that laundrymen were accused of having ruined. Okay, that's enough of that. Okay. Oops, let me get this back to where it should be. Oops. Okay. Just imagine, okay, so as I said, my parents were refugees from China. I'm growing up in the Midwest, on the prairie, and, I don't remember if I actually saw that cartoon, but there are many of other things that if you dig back deep enough, we've seen, right, on television. And I, first of all, I thought it was really funny. This kind of thing is really quite funny. But at the same time, it's really bizarre. And in some ways, watching it now, in 2015, is a very strange kind of experience, because in some ways, some of us may remember that kind of image, that kind of animation, or Charlie Chan, for that matter, that kind of representation. But we're watching it from the point of view right now, and there's this kind of funny juxtaposition of two moments in time, places against each other. And that creates some kind of startling, well, it's kind of odd, it's uncomfortable, but at the same time it's really kind of funny. So how can you appreciate that particular fragment at that time, in what was going on at that time, which is very much about kind of a comic otherness. In other words, outgroups, of course, are oftentimes in some ways made out. I mean, we know this from high school, right? We all remember, we're still recovering all of this, right? From all the craziness that happened in junior high school and high school, right? And we remember how groups operated and what it meant to be an outsider of that group, and how all sorts of, somebody would have cooties, all of a sudden, and they would be considered somebody that you wouldn't talk to, right? So I'm not saying this is anything different from that, really, but when it's writ large in a kind of social, historical sense, and it's actually broadcast on the media, of course it takes on a different proportion. But nowadays we're kind of looking at these things, and it's kind of odd, it doesn't make any sense. We've changed. But at the same time, this is a fragment from the past that I think we need to kind of reckon with. So that's one more fragment. Another fragment is the evil threat. Okay, and this is the one that I think most of us kind of recognize when we think about the terminology of Yellow Peril. Right? Now, Yellow Peril itself is a term that's kind of disappeared in some ways from the American imagination, but it was not that long ago that Yellow Peril was kind of omnipresent in terms of the American popular imagination. And this is just an example, just in case you need a refresher, okay? This is an example of a kind of Yellow Peril image in which you have, so this is an example of Pulp Fiction, right? And Pulp Fiction was, of course, made on a very poor quality paper. if you're to find it now at a flea market, it's the kind of thing that the paper begins to disintegrate very quickly because of the acid content in it. But the covers were what sold these pulp pieces. And what's interesting about this particular example is that this was the cover, but inside there was no story that had anything to do with the cover. But this cover sold really well. And you have, of course, the classic motif. And again, I have this out-of-body experience. It's a very effective, graphically, very effective graphic in which you have the evil Chinaman. In this case, he's not yellow, he's green, kind of like a Martian. And then you've got those incredible fingers, which are almost like animal-like. They're almost like a spider, or they're kind of a claw, but they look like they have their own life in the way they're kind of so animated in the drawing. And of course, there's the white woman who's being threatened by the dangerous evil man, right? Well, this is not unique to Chinese Americans or Asian Americans. I mean, this is kind of a classic motif of the threatening Indian, the threatening American Indian, or the threatening black man. But to have it also be applied here and to be effective in selling this particular issue of the Master Detective is another fragment that I think is important and valuable for us to kind of look at. And then, so you're seeing we're kind of going back historically, and I'm trying to recover these fragments and try to juxtapose them together in a way that begins to make some sense. And this is what I'm hoping we can actually talk about. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts. Then there's this really wild, comic, evil threat document that's actually quite important. I don't know how many of you remember the name Samuel Gompers. How many of you, okay. Samuel Gompers was the founding of the American Federation of Labor. He was also an immigrant cigar worker who had come from England and began organizing cigar workers, and then kind of rose up through the ranks of skilled, organizing skilled laborers. And in 1902, he authored this kind of amazing brochure. I don't know if you can see it. Let me read it out for you. 1902, Some Reasons for Chinese Exclusion, Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Coolieism, Which Shall Survive? And it's published by the American Federation of Labor, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how many of you have seen this, right? This is the kind of thing that has really been disappeared. And in a weird kind of way, it's disappeared in a way that those cartoons haven't been disappeared, but those two have also been kind of submerged, although you can find it on YouTube, right? But this is the kind of thing which you can also find online now. Tends to appear to be a very odd artifact that makes no sense, right? Today we all eat rice. Rice is a part of our diet, but this is clearly written at a moment in which rice, of all things, was seen as somehow very foreign, very exotic, very different. But then when we think of meat versus rice, well, we know, we're all trying to cut down on meat now, right? But this is a time where manhood was defined in part by how much meat, you could consume, right? The more meat, the more manly you were somehow, right? Okay? And so this American manhood against Asiatic coolieism, the word Asiatic itself is really rather arcane and peculiar. Asiatic cholera, Asiatic flu, it appears to be this, you can say Asia, Asian, but this kind of gets at kind of the ways in which terms and terminology begin to morph and change. Asiatic, I think, is a particularly kind of archaic and awkward and kind of ugly and clunky term. The coolieism also is something that's probably disappeared. I think occasionally we'll hear the word cyber coolie in terms of referring to somebody who's working in the tech industry and kind of working really hard. We know the word coolie tends to imply somebody who's extremely hard worker and probably not paid much, right? Cheap labor is the usual association. So which shall survive is the interesting part. It's really a zero-sum game. It's either one or the other. There's no other option of both coinciding in the same place. Now, I should just give you a little bit of a clue. Samuel Gompers, who, as I mentioned, was an immigrant himself, he was trying to basically extend permanently the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in 1882. Now, I don't know how many people have heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act. How many people have? Okay. But many have not, right? I was just seeing someone said, oh, you haven't heard of it. And it's one of those things about American history that I think is actually foundational to the history of the country, but it's not really known about. So part of the question becomes, why don't we know about some of these fragments? Why don't we know about some of these histories? And what is it that we do know about? I mean, my students, of course, are much more aware of, you know, the latest little gossip about one of their favorite singers. Right? That they'll know about, you know, and this is true for all of us. But they won't know about other things, right? So what is it that we remember? What is it that we focus on? What is it that we obsess about? And what are things that are kind of basic that we tend to not even know about, right? So those are some of the questions as a curator, as a historian, as someone who's trying to engage in public questions that, that we deal with. And it's part of the reason why I collect things, quite frankly, as well. I'm going to show a piece about that's from the contemporary moment, which is called The Chinese Professor. It was actually shown in 2010, 2012, 2014. These are during election year cycles. So it's very contemporary. And the reason I want to show it is that I want to suggest that after having gone through all this, in some ways you'll begin to see a certain pattern. Now, I think in the contemporary moment we tend to think of Yellow Peril and kind of racism as not really acceptable. I think on the public surface we kind of know that, well, these things are not quite the way they should be. It's a kind of post-civil rights awareness, post-human rights awareness. So in some ways, what still happens, though, is now more coded. It's kind of filtered through another set of ways that are not quite as obvious. It used to be that if you had a Fu Manchu mustache, or you had that kind of claw, yellow claw, and the Fu Manchu mustache, or any other kind of combination of these kinds of symbols that people immediately recognize, there's a kind of common language that everybody immediately kind of understood, oh, whether you agreed with it or not, you understood this is what was being conveyed. Now in some ways we're operating in a moment in which these things are below the surface, and it's a different kind of coding system that's happening. And we don't always necessarily notice what's going on. And certainly our children and our children's children, who in some ways have been brought up with more innocence from this stuff, are not necessarily seeing its connection to what had happened before. But let me show you this particular piece. And then we're going to quickly wrap up this part of my presentation, because I really just wanted you all to have a chance to see some things that we can then talk about. So this is, I'm sorry, let me see, where's, no, that's not what I want you to see.
I think you might have minimized.
You minimized it.
Chinese professor.
Oh, did I do that?
Yeah.
Well, this is the laundry blues that I minimized. Oh, I see, you're right. Okay, that's, okay, cancel that. Try this one. Thanks. Now you know why Judy depend on her all the time.
Every great man, there's a woman shaking her head.
Yeah, sad but true. Okay, here we go. Chinese Professor, 2010.
为什么强大的国家都会走向灭亡呢？古希腊、罗马、不列颠帝国、美国，因为他们都犯同样错误，原来使得他们成功的原则背道而驰。美国政府企图以庞大的开支和税收来摆脱严重的经济衰退，巨额的所谓刺激开支。 庞大的医疗改革，政府接管私有企业，债务累累。当然，我们是他们的大债主。现在他们都得给我们干活。
You can't change the future. You have to. Join Citizens Against Government Waste to stop the spending that is bankrupting America.
So what I'd like to do is stop here for a moment and for us to just be able to kind of talk a little bit. So maybe we could put up the lights. Yeah, that'd be great. And so what I've done here, I mean, this is what I do in preparing for a talk or preparing for an exhibit. I'll glean through the millions of possible things that we could pull as an artifact and begin to kind of think about, well, what's the theme of this exhibit or this talk, and then kind of begin to put them together. But the work I've done in my life in terms of helping to build, helping to start in 1980 the New York Chinatown History Project, and now it's called the Museum of Chinese America. It's designed by Maya Lin. The interior is designed by Maya Lin. I hope you can all come down and take a look at it. Or I've been the chief historian for an exhibit that's at the New York Historical Society right now called Chinese American Exclusion/Inclusion. Or working on film projects or working on anything that I'm doing. It's really trying to figure out how can I put these items together as a historian and kind of have it create a space in which we can have a discussion. So really what I did today was, this stuff is what fascinates me. Now, it may just say something about me, I don't know, because I'm obsessed about this stuff, and I think it has to do something with that innocent compliment that I got as a kid, in combination with other things. But I'd love to hear what you all have to say about these different fragments. What are some of the fragments that say something to you, that you might remember? But also, we're talking about different times and places now, and the juxtaposition of these different things. Yeah, so now.
My first thought was, we had a Chinese exchange student live with us for a year. He was attending Lincoln Academy. And I was thinking, once we committed to the idea of having a Chinese student live with us, it suddenly gave Pam and I and my kids room for quite a discussion about what we thought we were about to experience, what we thought of Chinese culture, and wondered where we were wrong and what we had to be careful about. And then it also occurred to me that maybe there's a Chinese anodyne for this, for preconceptions about Americans, that it's just a parallel, what you're talking about, only from the Chinese point of view. And I thought there's potential for real collision here. It's just a clash of cultures, but actually it worked out very well, because at the bottom line, when we got to know this boy and his parents indirectly, we realized it's just human kindness kind of cuts through it all. And that's the lesson we came away from. And it's suddenly your concept of the evil threat and all that, which were kind of probably floating around in the back of our heads, went away. And we ended up with a whole different experience. And it was quite pleasant.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear other people's stories and just kind of open the discussion and just, examples. Yeah, great.
I just share that I was in China last April for the first time, and the guide we had on one of the tours, his English was so good. It's better than mine could ever be, which was amazing. Also, he understood he'd never been out of China. He understood the American sense of humor, which was wonderful too, and everyone loved this person. I also, when I flew from Beijing to Xi'an, someone sat beside me, and during most of the flight we didn't talk much, and I looked over, he was Chinese. In fact, everyone on the plane was practically Chinese, and he was reading in English Einstein's theory of relativity. So I said to him, are you a student? And he says, yeah, he's going for his PhD in astrophysics. And he also shared, this was his first time on a plane, and he was having the best time. So anyway, we email each other, and he's engaged, and it's just such a wonderful experience. But when we got back, and I showed friends the slides and told them, I was so impressed with Chinese people. I was just blown away. The majority of people would say, but you didn't really, you just went where the tourists go. You didn't really see what it's really like. So there's this feeling, I don't know, it seems like our culture demonizes to the point that we can't even accept the things that are good. And it's the Chinese people that are so good. And I don't know, I was so impressed, I want to go back. So.
Well, great story.
Yeah.
Really good story. Very lots of telling kinds of questions that we can really kind of jump off. In some ways, the 2 points are related. So, yes, just love to hear anecdote, story, and I really think that these are important. Just jokes, silly things that happen, little instances. I think the more we kind of bring to the surface different kinds of anecdotes and things that have happened, the more, to me, that's what it's about. How can we start talking about this stuff? How can we do it in a public way that's no longer, this is what happened to me, in the 3rd grade, and I don't want to talk about it. I think we have to talk about these things. So are there other things that people kind of remember, or little stories, or little examples of things that you've seen, or, come out of your own experiences, whatever? I'd love to hear that. So, anybody? Yes.
Oh, just sort of the general attitude. I was down on Long Island. I was teaching Chinese in high school, and the classes almost got canceled because a lot of the school board said, "Well, you don't want to be teaching those communist languages." So that's another part of the Yellow Peril, is that they're commies. Of course, they're not really anymore, but that certainly fed into that whole narrative about the evil of them.
Yeah, the Yellow Peril very much led to the Red Peril. What kind of red?
Yeah, it all got very blended together.
Yeah. And for a language to be, so a communist language being
communist
painted in
language.
that way. Yeah. I actually have a story about my brother, who's now passed away, a much older brother, and he was studying in the late 40s at Northwestern University in mechanical engineering. He later on went to work for International Harvester and other kinds of things. But he had one teacher who this was of course during, actually this was in the early 50s, excuse me. This is during the Korean War, just at the early point of it. And this one teacher who happened to be quite racist and was known to be racist said he canceled his fellowship, his PhD fellowship, because he automatically assumed he was a communist. Now, my brother is the farthest thing that anybody could say from a communist, but just by the racial association,
Right.
he was automatically de facto thought to be a communist.
Yeah, they got layered on top of everything.
Yeah. So it did actually happen. So those 2 moments, we're talking about when in Long Island.
Yeah, like the 80s.
Okay, so those 2 moments, early 50s, 80s. Interesting, how do they relate? The good news is that he went to the University of Wisconsin. That's part of why our family has a lot of connections to the University of Wisconsin. There were 2 young faculty who had just gotten hired in their new mechanical engineering department. And one of them was a European man, and the other man was a Japanese American who had just left the concentration camps, got his PhD, and became a professor in this brand new engineering program. So he welcomed my brother. They didn't carry that same kind of baggage, and he actually he flourished there. So I don't mean to suggest that these are all one-way stories. I think the two-way process and the fact that there's always pushback, there's always some kind of contestation over this stuff. And in some ways, I feel like laughing about this stuff is actually part of the pushback, right? It's actually important for us to kind of look at this stuff and kind of deal with it. So, I'd love to hear any other stories, things, anecdotes that people have, because I know you guys have them. So anything else? Yeah, please.
My daughter was in school out of state, and she said, "Mom, I'd like to bring Kathleen home for this vacation time, 3 or 4 days." And I said, "Oh, lovely." I said, "We'll be glad to have her." And got another phone call, and she said, "Mom, Kathleen's mother's coming." I said, "Oh, okay." I counted the beds, and we had enough space. And so it was fine for Kathleen and her mom to be with us. But it was very interesting because Mom was Chinese. Kathleen was, Mom and Dad were Chinese. But Mom had lost her husband, and it was almost Kathleen's shadow. And it was fascinating to me. She didn't want a bed of her own. She was going to sleep in the bed with her sister, or with her daughter, rather, which was fine. Okay. And when I was preparing meals, I opened the pantry door. And she came to the pantry and said, "Oh my, that's a lot of food." And Kathleen said, "Mom, shh." And what Mom didn't understand, she lived in New York City, and she probably had a grocery store around the corner. And for us, it takes about 25 minutes to get to the grocery store and 45 back, so I'm going to buy a little extra for meals. And that set me to thinking a lot more. And just the other day, I opened the pantry door and I said, "Wow, there's a lot of stuff here," and I thought of Kathleen's mother.
Yeah, it's those differences. It's those moments of differences that all of a sudden it kind of sparks some awareness of oneself, right? And also potentially opens the door to try and understand that other person. So you had some insight that this person's from New York City. That's why they tended not to have so much room, in part because our apartments tend to be smaller and less room. But yeah, so, okay.
There's another time that she brought someone else home who was Chinese, probably still is Chinese.
Well, it's kind of hard to say what that means. What is it? Does it mean that you eat Chinese food? Or that, so you speak Chinese, or is it that? Yeah, in that case, yeah.
And she was very timid. And no mother came this time because Mom was in China. And we tried to make her feel as comfortable as possible. And I think she had a good time. And when she left, she presented me with a beautiful wooden box that opened up and had beautiful wooden combs. And the tops of the combs were lovely Chinese ladies in beautiful gowns. And I was overwhelmed. I had nothing for her other than my house and meals, but she felt that this was something she should do. And so we talked about it a little bit. She said, "My mother has packed several things for me to bring as gifts." And my children would bring a box of candy or some flowers, but this was something, I treasure that. It was a very nice thing.
Lovely story. Yeah. Yes?
Well, I just turned 80, and I was born in Central Maine. And talking about French-Canadian background, a governor who should remain nameless, and I associate with his outspokenness. And I said, for the first time in our life, we have a French-Canadian governor. Look at the example we've got. And, the stereotype is, if you're a French Canadian, you moved to Central Maine to work in the factories. And I'm the youngest of 7 daughters. My sisters were all older. And the stereotype was, if you went to high school, you weren't expected to end up in college. That was the stereotype. If you were French Canadian, you just went to work at the mill. And I mean, they look at you and they look at you and they know you're Chinese. They look at me and they don't know that I'm an outspoken French Canadian. And it's human nature.
But the dynamic of otherness and that
Yes,
long
but I mean,
memory of stereotyping is still there.
I had brother-in-laws that were fantastic athletes, and they went to work at the mill. That was the stereotype. You didn't educate your children. Because, I mean, and the teachers, God bless them, if they had French-Canadian kids, they knew they weren't going to college. Yes, they knew they weren't going to college. And that's the way I think even teachers here who have children that are, they know that they don't mean to prejudge them, but they do. They see what they're coming from. They're not going to go to college.
Yeah, it's such a complicated situation because, of course, you all know that Maine and Vermont are kind of thought of as the whitest states in the nation. But that hides a lot of things as well, right? So that whiteness may appear, certainly from people from away, to be the case, but you're digging up this much more complicated dynamic in history.
Right, and I think people that move here, they don't know the history of the northern part of Maine.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Judy and I just came back with our daughter from Louisiana, and we had a chance to get out to Lafayette and kind of Cajun.
And if you go to New Orleans, the first thing the tour operator tells you is a Cajun joke.
Oh, really? Oh, can you tell that joke with us?
And, you know, it's all over the country. I mean,
Okay,
I went to New Orleans and the tour operator said, oh, well, let me, and I thought, God, they're here already. You know, they judge the Cajuns. I mean, they don't judge you by the way you look, but they judge the Cajuns by the way you look.
Right. And they've been there since the
Yes.
1800s.
Right.
Yeah. So, yes, up here, and then we'll come back around again. Yeah,
I have a grandson who is 7, and last year my husband and I were babysitting while our kids were away. And my daughter had told me ahead of time that Jacob's very good friend Peter was coming for a play date during the time we were babysitting. And that Peter was Chinese, and both his parents were Chinese. So I had a stereotype of a different kind in mind. I expected a very bright, well-behaved young child. And Peter was rambunctious and disrespectful. And I thought, wow, I just stereotyped a kid, you know, based on what I've been told about his ethnicity. He was delightful, but he was a real surprise.
Yeah, the teachers on the Lower East Side have told me over the decades that as new immigrants arrived, first of all, the new immigrants would work hard like crazy, they fulfilled all the stereotypes they were talking about, they'd be very polite, they'd give gifts, etc., etc. But then the longer those same kids, let's say their siblings, were in the Lower East Side, not just Lower East Side, but in the country, the more Americanized they got. So more rambunctious, etc., etc. So, back here, and then we'll come back to people who already have.
Just to follow that up, I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say. There's a stereotype, and they can be damaging too. The stereotype, oh, all Chinese are very smart, automatically. Well, you know, what if you're not brilliant? I mean, I think that can be difficult.
Yeah, there is, within Asian American studies, there's a critique of what's called the model minority theory. And part of the critique is that it's oftentimes used, it puts a lot of pressure on the kids, okay, first of all. And there's complicated things that we can talk about that in terms of how parents and families and all that do that and don't do it. But also, it pops up at certain times. This is one moment in which it's used quite a bit. And in part, it's oftentimes pointing to other racial groups, blacks and Latinos, especially poor blacks and Latinos, and saying, well, if this one group can do it, then you guys can do it too. So it's used in a variety of ways at different times. That's actually quite tricky. I've been involved in a College Board report and study that got published a few years ago that's kind of looking at this question. And really it comes down to being linked to immigration policy, this country's immigration policies. I don't know if you heard last night, yesterday on NPR, when we were driving down up here, NPR did a piece about the immigration clause since 1990 that's been increasingly used quite a bit, that if you have $500,000 and you're willing to employ 10 people, then you get the fast track in terms of getting through the immigration process. Instead of 10 years, it could take 1 year. It just so happens that as China has emerged and become, a certain part of the Chinese population has done well, there are a lot of Chinese who are coming through that escape clause. And, so I think we tend to think, well, that's interesting because on the one hand, they're the Chinese, and the report was kind of focusing a lot on the Chinese and not talking about other groups who are using that clause. On the other hand, it's really a class clause in the sense that if you have $500,000 and you're willing to employ, so how class and race are oftentimes used are kind of slippery sometimes. So that's an example of the model minority. a lot of the Chinese immigrants who are coming over actually have a huge amount of what sociologists will call cultural capital, educational capital. They may not have much money, but they already have a very strong educational background, for example, that then they can kind of transfer when they arrive into this country in some way that's actually, in some way that's it must be an emergency phone call from my daughter or something, I'm not sure. That can be transferred easily into this cultural context. So that's kind of one of the tricky dynamics in terms of how groups are represented. It also means that things are oftentimes triangulated. I don't know if you remember the film Rising Sun, for example. That was with, a lot of you have seen that. Okay, it was a novel from Michael Crichton, and Philip Kaufman had directed it. And it starred Wesley Snipes, who was a great actor, and also Sean Connery, and it was, I think, even produced by Sean Connery. It was from the Michael Crichton novel, The Rising Sun, talking about the rise of Japanese corporations and buying up buildings in Los Angeles. And that's an example of the buddy film in which Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes were two cops coming together to fight the Japanese invasion into Los Angeles, to fight the Japanese buying up whole properties and committing rather sadomasochistic sexual crimes, right? So it kind of goes back to the mystery detective kind of image. So there's always a triangulation oftentimes. Well, whites and black can get together, but in some ways if we do it in contrast to that other group. I think our time is kind of winding up, so maybe one more comment? Yeah, Beth?
John, could you take a couple minutes
Sure.
to speak about the museum in New York City?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
And how that museum might modify some of the thinking that has accumulated in terms of how we see Chinese in America.
So part of the question becomes, I just worked on an exhibit at the New York Historical Society, but when I first arrived in New York and back in 1975, okay, and I started researching different collections, I couldn't find anything at the New York Historical Society. So when you think about that moment, 1975, well, 1970s, late 1970s, to now, where they actually sponsored a major exhibit, they raised major monies to do this exhibit. They've been getting huge attendance to their exhibits. New York Times covered the exhibit and all these other things. That's a huge difference in that same institution. So I think we in part started, at the time, the New York Chinatown History Project, in part out of that kind of lack of people collecting things, the lack of a different kind of representation being shown. And the museum has done well as well. It survived, despite very rocky economic times.
Where is it located?
It's at 215 Center Street, which is just kind of adjacent to what used to be thought of as Little Italy and Soho. Just below that beautiful Beaux-Arts police headquarters on Grand Street. So I encourage you all to go next time you're in the city and take a look. So over the years, we began collecting things, we began showing exhibits, we began trying to present a counter image. We actually, our first exhibit was on the history of Chinese laundry workers. So you can just imagine, because that was the dominant image that I think all of us had, including myself, of laundries. And we're of a generation where Chinese hand laundries and Chinese restaurants were the dominant way in which we knew something about this population. And we think now about how much that's changed, right? And it's really changed because of the immigration laws. So we also deal with the history of immigration laws, the history of Chinese exclusion, but also the post-exclusion laws. And technically in 1943, the law was repealed, but it defaulted to the 1924 law, which was basically driven by eugenics, which meant that 105 people could come here. So if you go from exclusion to 105 people, that's not exactly taking away, it's not saying we're welcoming all of you to come. And the 24 law was based on, again, this is another part of our history, because really what I'm interested in, I'm really an American historian. So everything I write about is about American history. My book, New York Before Chinatown, it's about New York, but people tend to think that, oh, he's the guy who's expert on Chinatown, right? But the 1924 law was driven by eugenics, and eugenicists were talking about, and a lot of you know this, especially when we talk about kind of French-American issues, there were the Nordic or Teutonic Europeans who were considered the superior Europeans. It's coming out of New York City. It's not coming out of some ignorant, little backwater place, whatever that place might be. It's out of New York City, among the very elite of New York City, the most educated people in New York City. And then they talk about the Alpine Europeans, who are mainly, they meant, this is a code word for Jews, who are coming into the cities, and then they're talking about the Mediterranean Europeans, and they're talking about the Italians, basically, the Sicilians. And those are the groups that were basically stopped, just about nearly eliminated in the quotas from coming. So the quotas that were set meant that the Chinese there could only be given the quota system that was established in 1924, 105 Chinese coming into this country. So we look at that, but we also, I should say, really celebrate contemporary artists. There's a brochure in there for a show that we did of the prints of Philip Chen, who grew up in Chicago. He teaches in Iowa and Des Moines. Really a wonderful writer. Wonderful printmaker, a wonderful artist. Right now there's this beautiful exhibit of Tyrus Wong's images. Tyrus was one of those Disney animators who worked on Bambi, and he actually knew, I'm sorry.
Jake
Davis.
Davis.
Okay, he knew, they worked together. So it's a small world, but we're also celebrating those amazing transformations. He's someone who was, as a boy, was forced to go through the detention center at Angel Island, which was, once the law was enacted, all Chinese were presumed to be guilty and had to go through a detention center to prove that they had come into this country, or they were sent back. Right? So Tyrus was one of those people who actually made it through that interrogation system at the age of 10, I think, and went on to. So I guess I should end here, but thank you very much. I'll just end with this one slide, which is, this slide. It's really to say that this is the reason, thanks, Jim. The reason why I use the word haunted and haunting the future is that I think until we can kind of bring to the surface these kinds of things from the past that are still within us, they're still part of our complicated mix of desire and unresolved issues. The past is always going to be coming back and kind of haunting us and surprising us and kind of biting us in the tush in some way that could be totally unexpected. And this is actually a political cartoon. I won't go into the details of it, but it's when the U.S. was really complaining to Russia before it became the Soviet Union as excluding Jewish Americans. And that's what Uncle Sam was holding as a petition. And he's surprised by the fact that he forgot or didn't deal with the fact that this country was still excluding Chinese. So this political cartoonist was kind of weighing in on that matter. So to me it represents, there are surprises now. If we're going to solve climate change issues, we have to work with China, for example. And we can't be constantly setting up huge tariffs against Chinese solar technologies with the full understanding that it's a complicated international competition for gaining market share and gaining dominance, and who can master those technologies and sell it to more people. But we don't have enough time for those issues. We know from this winter, but also from the drought that's happening across the country, and the West Coast especially, 6 to 10% of the snowfall has only hit Southern California all the way up to Oregon, where I've just come from. And we're in a serious moment now, and we can't afford to have these ghosts still be unresolved and come back to haunt us in ways that surprise us. We've got to deal with them and really reckon with them up front. Yes?
I just wanted to point out that the United States is still discriminating against other countries in terms of tourist visas, for example. It's almost impossible for a native of Thailand to come to the United States today. They can't get tourist visas.
Thanks for that point. Yeah, so I'm happy to stick around, and I brought a bunch of stuff to show people I haven't talked to you about it. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.